Back when I tested the top-of-the-line Taycan Turbo S, I said I wasn't going to compare it to the Tesla Model S because I don't actually think they have that much in common.
But he's not the boss, I am. And while I agree that these are very different cars for very different people, I actually don't think that matters that much because listen, if you've got 6 figures to spend on an all-electric sedan, it comes down to one of these two.
Okay, right off the top, I have to admit that Jody's right. If you're in the market for an electric sedan like this, it's going to come down to one of these two, but that's because there are only these two on the market right now. I know there are some more in the pipeline, but right now, if you have your heart set on a premium electric sedan, it's going to come down to the Tesla Model S or the Porsche Taycan, but that's not a bad problem to have. I also need to point out that we borrowed both of these from Porsche Canada for this comparison. And I know that might seem a little bit weird borrowing a Tesla from Porsche, but considering Tesla doesn't like to loan its products out to the media, this is what we're left with. A dealership that's owned by Porsche Canada took this thing in as a trade, and the PR manager decided it would be a good idea to loan it out for a test like this. And I actually think it's a really good idea. This thing hasn't been modified or altered in any way. It's just a 2019 Model S 100D with about 18,000 kilometers on the odometer. I know that means it doesn't quite have the range of some of the newer trims, but considering range varies so much depending on conditions, weather, how you drive, all of those different factors, we're not going to let it weigh too heavily in our decision here.
So what actually matters the most for this comparison is pricing and how the two stack up. So according to the window sticker for the Model S that Dan is driving, it was purchased for $111,000 when it was new. But since then, Tesla has actually dropped the price, so now you can get into a Model S for $102,000. On the other hand, this Taycan 4S starts at $120,000, but after you add in all of those options, the price gets bumped up to $165,000. So there is a huge price difference between the two. And don't get me wrong, I don't think Porsche is crazy for charging that price because it does feel like it's worth every penny, but it does hurt the value proposition for the 4S quite a bit. Keep in mind that this is supposed to be the most affordable Taycan you can get, and even so, it's only $25,000 less than the most expensive Model S, so there really is a big price difference there. And because this is the most affordable Taycan you can buy, it also means it has the least amount of power. So it comes with 429 horsepower, though this one has the bigger battery pack, so it has 482. And even without driving the Turbo S Taycan, I can tell you that this one is more than fast enough for most people's needs. Using launch control, you can get to 100 kilometers an hour in 4 seconds flat, which is ridiculous. And what I love the most about it is that as soon as you hit the accelerator, all of that torque just rushes at you. It hits you in the face, and the response is instantaneous. And that's exactly what makes this EV so addictive. It uses separate motors for the front and rear, so it has all-wheel drive, and in total it outputs about 500 pound-feet of torque. And that just makes the Taycan 4S feel like a spaceship. It just has warp speed, and it's so much fun.
Just like Jody in that Taycan, this is my first time driving a Tesla, and I am very impressed with the performance. Even though this one isn't designated as a performance model, it is very quick, and it's hilarious to jam on that skinny pedal and take off like a supercar. It never gets old just how fascinating electric motors are. But the cool thing about both of these cars is that they do seem to encourage more relaxed driving to help you make the most of these battery packs. Now again, since this one is a 2019, it doesn't quite have the range of a newer Model S, but you've still got an estimated range of 540 kilometers, which is way more than that Taycan. But it has been pretty cold this week, so I haven't been getting anything close to that. Earlier this week when Jody and I switched cars, I'd used about 40% of the battery and covered 130 kilometers. Jody did about 125 kilometers and used the same 40% of the Taycan's battery. So it just goes to show you that weather has a very large impact, and that's why we can't let it weigh on our decision here. But I'm not doubting the fact that this Tesla could travel a lot further under normal springtime or summer conditions. That's just a reality, and the rest of the auto industry really is playing catch up.
So we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty on which car wins because it has more range, just because there's so many different variables that affect how much range an EV gets, you know, stuff like your driving style, whether or not you're using the HVAC, and even the weather outside. So while the Tesla Model S does have more outright range, both should be completely fine to handle a week's worth of commuting and shouldn't even be an issue, especially if you have a place at home to charge. Tesla does have a slight edge in terms of charging just because their superchargers are so widely available. So you've got this touch panel down here on the console, and that's how you cycle through options like music and air conditioning. Then you've got a pretty complex infotainment system and a digital gauge cluster that can be a bit tricky to get the hang of. You know, just doing simple stuff like resetting the trip computer is more complicated than it needs to be, and Porsche's infotainment in its other cars is much more user-friendly, and I would love to see that implemented here. On top of that, this one's got the optional passenger display that puts a separate screen in front of whoever's riding shotgun. Dan likes it a lot, but I actually think it's a bit unnecessary, especially since if you're sitting in the passenger seat, it's pretty easy just to reach across and use the screen in the middle anyways. So by comparison, the interior in the Model S is really as simple as it gets. The main showstopper here is this absolutely enormous touchscreen that centralizes everything you need to do in one space. And then on this side, you have a simplified digital gauge cluster that has your speedometer and your tire pressure and stuff like that. And so this big touchscreen has a couple of gimmicky features, like it has games you can play in a romance mode, and it even has a little sketch pad where you can make little doodles. But in general, it's just really approachable and user-friendly. You just set up your phone once via Bluetooth, you get in and you go. It's that simple. But besides this giant touchscreen, there's really not that much else in this interior to get excited about. It is pretty plain in here.
I do agree with Jody that it is a lot more complicated in here, but it doesn't take too long to get used to it. Yes, you do have this touch panel down here on the console that you have to use to run your HVAC controls or just about anything else. And then you have the central touchscreen as well as this optional one in front of the passenger. There are even touch controls on either side of the gauge cluster. You do need to crack that owner's manual when you first get in, but after a while, it's not too bad. Something else I really like about this Taycan, it has Apple CarPlay. And since you've watched so many of my reviews and you subscribe to autoTRADER.ca, you know I am a big fan of that smartphone interfacing system. And you know, I was a little bit bummed out that you can't get that in the Tesla Model S, and you can't get Android Auto either, but that is a good infotainment system overall, though one nit to pick. It's great, it has a Spotify app in there, but no Apple Music. So for someone like me who prefers Apple Music, well, I'm out of luck. I can listen to my audio using Bluetooth, but I can't access my catalog. That's a bit of a bummer, but again, it's something I can live with because the infotainment system itself is so good. And again, so is this one once you get the hang of it. One of the big reasons I say these two are so different are their general vibes. And I know I went on earlier about the fact that they're both really mellow to drive, and that still holds true. But in the Tesla, it really feels that way inside the cabin, whereas this is pure Porsche sports car. The seating position, the steering wheel, the way you sit so low inside this car, it just screams Porsche. And so if you've driven a Porsche in the past, it will feel very familiar despite the powertrain in here. That does have its pros and its cons. It is a little bit more difficult to get in and out of than the Tesla, but again, it just feels a lot more special than the Model S. That thing is a bit of a disappointment, especially when you look at some of the materials in there. The leather upholstery isn't all that nice, and some of the plastics inside are terrible. I was expecting something like a Mercedes S-Class, but it's a lot more like the CLA, and it just doesn't feel like it's worth its six-figure price tag. And I know some of you out there might be saying that it's the powertrain you're paying for, but still, if you're gonna spend that kind of money on a car, don't you want it to feel that way? No matter which trim of the Taycan you get, you do get Porsche grade materials. They feel nice, and even with this, it's a $5,000 upgrade to get this leather-free interior, and it is fantastic. This faux suede on the steering wheel and the seats, as well as this fake leather on the door panels, it all feels great, and I love this blue-gray color. It contrasts so nicely with this robin's egg blue exterior, and it is really eye-catching. I really like the atmosphere it creates in here. I'll also say that this space is a little bit more usable than than the Teslas. No, not overall, that has a little bit more passenger room, but when it comes to storage for your stuff, the console bin here is great to have. You have this cubby underneath as well as two very usable cup holders, whereas in the Tesla, they're a little bit far back and they're where you place your arm. And then the other thing is the Tesla doesn't even have door pockets. I understand that's an aesthetic choice, but it's terrible when you need to put your stuff somewhere. This has massive door pockets all around, and that is great to see. And then you get storage front and back, which is great for all your gear. But obviously, way more important is the way they drive, and I don't think it's going to surprise many of you to learn that this is the nicer of the two in that regard. You also have a bunch of different drive modes in here, which is great. Now, this does have the Sport Chrono package, but that means you have stuff like Sport and Sport Plus, so you can really unleash this thing's full potential, and it is so responsive. All the stuff I said about the Turbo S apply here, just on a slightly lower scale. This one also has the optional four-wheel steering setup, but it's not something you need. I've driven the Taycan without it, and it still feels very agile and responsive without.
So the two cars drive very differently and they have very different personalities. So the Taycan is probably the one you'd want to pick for a fun weekend out in wine country, but the Model S is the one you'd want for the drive up to the cottage because it's a lot more comfortable and relaxed. So obviously the Porsche is the sports car of the two. So this isn't as engaging and responsive as that, but it still drives really well. The steering feels great, and in general, it just feels really confident and composed.
To recap, we like the Taycan because it looks and feels like a Porsche for the kind of performance it delivers even in this 4S trim and the quick charging capability it has. We don't like how expensive it is with options, how complex the technology is inside, or that the fast chargers are so few and far between.
We like the Tesla Model S for how relaxed and comfortable it is, as well as the approachable technology and all the room it has inside. We don't like that some of the materials inside don't feel like they're worth the price, the excessive touch controls, or the fact that it doesn't come with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto.
I'm still not so sure that these two are natural competitors, but I do have to admit that they line up in at least a few different ways, especially with this 4S version of the Taycan. And it's every bit the Porsche it should be. Nothing's changed since the last time I drove one. This is an impressive machine, and it raises the bar for the entire Porsche brand.
And then you've got the Tesla Model S, a car that really shook up the whole automotive industry when it first came out 8 years ago. And what's so cool about it is that it's just as redefining now as it was back then.
In the end, we were very hard-pressed to pick a winner because these are both great at what they do. On one hand, you have the Taycan that looks and feels so special, and it's got decent all-electric driving range.
And on the other, maybe it's a little too tech-heavy, and the price does climb very quickly once you get all the options you want. Then you've got the Model S, which is like an old dog learning new tricks because it's got a ton of great technology, so it feels very modern, but also very approachable.
And I think that's going to be the key word here, approachable, because nothing else has made electric driving as easy as the Tesla Model S. But then again, it doesn't feel all that special, especially inside with some of those materials you get. No, it's not quite perfect, especially for the price tag, but when it comes down to the car that we would choose, it's gotta be the Tesla Model S.